Hey guys, we're uh, recording a video to sort of answer a lot of questions that are coming up from a lot of our clients and folks that have been reaching out about questions related to iOS's new iOS 14 release that we're expecting out later this year. And so thought we would just have a chat with our chief architect, Bill Francis, and just have a conversation that we'll bring you guys into and answer some questions, talk about some things that we're thinking about some things that everybody with apps need to probably be considering. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Francis. I'm one of the co-founders of N08. We're a digital product studio based here in the Dallas, Texas area, up in Plano. And as I mentioned, I'm joined here with our chief architect, Bill Francis. We'll go ahead and get it out of the way. We're not brothers. We just have the same last name. But
go even further to say that not just are we not brothers, but that we checked out ancestry.com.
Right? We're pretty sure, like even with DNA testing, that we're not actually very closely related or related at all. But funny. So cool, Bill. Thanks for hopping on the call. Sure. And chatting a little bit today. So I guess to start with the first question is, what do we know about iOS 14 so far? Like, what are some of the big highlights that you are aware of so far?
Right now, what we know, or what we believe we know, right, is that that it's, even with everything that's going on, right, it's still going to come out here probably in June. So first week of June, we should see the announcements that sort of solidify, exactly which, features are coming. But there's always, tons of rumors, right? So, I mean, things that we can probably expect for sure, right, are updates like to the widgets, or having the ability to add widgets to the home screen, sort of updates to the home screen in general. There's been a lot of talk about a fitness app, or a new fitness app that's coming out on iOS. There's some swirling rumors about, possibly being able to use the phone as a digital key to open your car, right, which is pretty cool. So those are some of the bigger things that we think might be there. But then beyond that, there are some things that, were announced previously that, that are being taken away from the devices, right, that really impacts our clients as well. So.
Is there like an example of something like that? Like, this is stuff that Apple's already announced before, but it's just going to take action in 14, or how does that work?
Yeah. So as an example, I believe 2 releases ago, right, they announced that they were going to stop accepting updates to apps that do social sign-in if you don't also include Apple's sign-in provider, right? So if your app currently lets you sign in with like Facebook or Twitter, and you're not also allowing people to sign in with the Apple sign-in, then your update going forward will be rejected from the store.
Got it. So if you had like Facebook login or Google login in your app, but you're not also including Apple login as one of those social login options, then potentially they would reject an update, right?
Yeah. So, and those are the kind of things, right, that that we need to get ahead of, right? And it's really tricky because I think it's 2018, like when they announced it, but they don't put a date on when it's going to go into effect, right? So I mean, it's been a couple of years, right? So we've expected, right, for the last couple of releases to be enforced, and it hasn't been.
Yeah.
But there's no, saying that that you didn't get fair warning, right? So
it's interesting because thinking about the apps that I use most frequently, I don't recall seeing an Apple login on any or very many of those. So is that because it looks different and maybe I'm just not paying attention, or is it that there's just a lot of the apps don't have that incorporated yet?
No, I really think a lot of them haven't incorporated it yet, right? And there are pretty specific rules around it. So like, if, for example, your app uses your own custom login, right? So you register the client yourself, you keep the information yourself, right? You handle the security and the privacy yourself. You don't have to have the Apple login. But if you were to also allow someone to, log in with Facebook as a convenience, right? Then you also need to allow them to log in with Apple ID as a convenience. So.
Yeah. This is not a small change, right? I mean, the UI is going to have to be impacted, right? Because they're going to have to figure out how to adjust login screens to put those on there. I wonder if it's also going to lead to people selecting social logins instead of having 3. Maybe they pick 2, and Apple has to be one of those 2. Do you think that's something potentially it's going to have to happen?
Potentially, right? I mean, it really, a lot of it depends on, a lot of it depends too, just on your analytics, right? I mean, if your logins are split right now between, Facebook and Instagram or Instagram, right? You're unlikely to, get rid of those, right? Just because you're adding a third one in, right? So.
Interesting. This may be a silly question, but where do people look for that kind of analytics? Is that in their own analytics they put in, or is there something that's already out of the box in their social accounts where they're using the social login that tells them how many people are using it?
There's not something easy that's baked in, right? So, but I mean, for the most part, right? If you're letting people, log in through multiple channels, at least, if we help you put your app together, right? I mean, we would have recommended that what channels those people are coming from.
Yeah, got it. What about this? So what about Android apps? I mean, does the Apple login, like the social login for Apple, do they have compatibility with Android so that they offer that as a social login on Android apps also?
That's a good question, right? My gut says that at some point there will be, an SDK or an API for that, but I don't really know at the moment if it's going to be there or not when it launches, right?
Interesting. Yeah. And at this point for iOS 14, at least, because that's sort of the kind of the theme of this conversation, is that we don't even know if they actually will start enforcing it. It's just there's a pretty good suspicion that they might, right?
Yeah, that one. Yeah, and there's another pretty big one too, right? For deprecation of OpenGL. Right?
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
Got it. And so, and what does that mean? So deprecation of OpenGL, what does that mean? What does that refer to?
So OpenGL is a low-level graphics library that's it's been used pretty heavily on everything except for Windows, right? Or Windows uses DirectX. It's to be honest, it's not a. I mean, it's a good move of Apple to move away from it, right? Because it really has not been, very well maintained or updated for the last couple of years, and it's pretty old, right? But it doesn't change the fact that pretty much any time that an app um, was using the canvas directly, so a lot of gaming apps, a lot of video apps, right? Things that are pretty like graphic intensive. They go directly to the GPU through OpenGL to get the performance, and so you're going to see that probably the library actually is not going to be present on iOS 14. So what that means is once once a device is updated to iOS 14, those applications that you have that have not been updated simply won't be compatible anymore with your device.
Got it. So users that already have the app installed, and then let's say that they update to iOS 14 and OpenGL is no longer available, the apps just won't launch, or what would we tend to expect?
I would expect that the apps wouldn't launch, right? And it would tell you, hey, these apps are no longer compatible. Maybe in best case scenario, like when you do the upgrade, right? It'll tell you, hey, these apps, are going to get removed, right? Because they're not going to be compatible.
Got it.
And and that one in particular puts some developers in a tricky spot, right? Because lots of times, so OpenGL programming is difficult, right? It's pretty low level, and it's not something that a lot of app developers do, right? And so, so they typically use some sort of gaming engine or framework or some sort of graphics engine that obfuscates that, right? And so, if the tool that they're using doesn't have a new updated version, right, they really don't even have a way to recompile the app, right, and submit an update to the store. They'll have to port the entire thing to something different.
Which could be a big undertaking, right? That could be a lot of work.
It could be a really big undertaking, right? So the technology that Apple created replacing it is called Metal, and it also I believe they have a sort of a library around it called Vulkan. But Metal and Vulkan, while really modern and performant, right? Programming it is quite different than programming OpenGL, right? So to give you an example, a really popular, or growing popular language, I guess, is doing Flutter development and Dart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they started their port of the OpenGL to Metal, I believe. I believe a year ago, March, right? And they still haven't actually turned on the a version of Flutter that compiles to Metal, right? And will work with the new what we expect to be the changes in iOS 14. So they, according to their blog, they're finished with it, and it's working well in all the testing, and they're just waiting to turn it on. But the point is that it took a pretty big team like that a year, right, to do the conversion of their tool, right? So if you're using a tool, right, that doesn't support that or hasn't started that support yet, right? You're in a lot of trouble, right? And you're going to have to probably find a different way to build your app.
Got it. So we're assuming that sort of our audience that may be listening or watching this video, some of them may be developers and they know exactly how to approach looking at their app. Maybe they're already thinking about it, but other people in this audience are more product managers, product owners. So their view of that's going to be much less technical, right? So if I'm a product owner and I'm thinking about my app and sort of assessing, what's the potential risk there? What are maybe some of the things I should be asking my development team to sort of assess that?
So there's no easy way to look at the app right from the outside and know.
Mm-hmm.
So you really have to find out from your development team, right? Whether it's in-house or not, right? If does your app have a dependency on OpenGL, right? And if the answer is yes, then you really need to look at what options are available to you, right? To remove that dependency, right? Because unlike on Android, where it takes years for people to update to the latest OS, on iOS, right? We typically expect within 30 days, 80-90% of the devices, right, to be running that version of the OS.
Yeah, it's much shorter, right?
Yeah. So and the good news is, there was 2 years notice, so a lot of the tools, right, have gone through the process of being updated. So if you're deploying regular updates to your app, then there's a good chance that you've already made this change in the internals and didn't even know it, right?
Yeah. Got it. Okay. What else? Like, what else would we expect coming down that might be something that people need to pay attention to potentially with the update?
So a lot of the stuff I think is still, is still up in the air, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
there's even some, lawsuits going on right now with Apple and Tile, right? About, potential Apple Tile competing technology, right? But whether that's going to be ready or not, for iOS 14, I think is a bit optimistic. But
Tile, you're talking about the little keychain like cards that do tracking. Is that what you're referring to?
yeah, yeah. So Apple definitely has a product in the works there called AirTags.
Okay.
And it's a direct competitor with Tile. But it has takes advantage of some hardware that on the devices, or the new devices, right, that hasn't been released to third-party developers, right? So
Mm-hmm.
and so because of that, right, Tile has been able to take Apple to court, and so they're so that may delay release on that, regardless of how far into it there are. I would expect also to see support for 5G in the new devices.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully,
In the hardware, right? Like at the hardware level, is that what you're talking about?
yeah. So obviously there's some software, updates that occur there too.
Uh-huh.
Or hopefully lower in the stack, meaning that it happens close enough to the hardware that existing applications and new applications don't really have to do a lot to take advantage of the faster speed. But again, we won't know for sure, right, until we see the release. And even just to just in my experience, even when the beta does come out, right, we really even don't know which things will make the final cut, right, until they go to the gold master. So we typically see 2, 3, 4 versions of a beta come out, right, and as that progresses, right, different features may be, disabled or re-enabled, right, depending on the feedback in general from the development community, and also just the aggressive timelines that they have to get out the new devices. So.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that just because the first beta of this includes or doesn't include something doesn't necessarily mean that's what the final drop of that new OS is going to be.
That's right. So typically the more user-facing features, of course, right? Apple, talks about, at their, sort of June event, and because of that, right, there's, pressure for those things, to stay, to be there, or to get to a completed state or some version of a completed state. But some of these more internal things that we're talking about, like, dropping support for OpenGL or something, right? It's always possible that, that it's not there, and then at the Gold Master, they actually put it back in. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess after the developer conference, which is usually in June, right? So they make that beta available shortly after that, typically.
Yeah, it usually is available, right then.
Okay. So why don't we let's talk a little bit about, like, what is our process for gauging readiness of an app, right? So we have customers that are on maintenance plans, and we sort of take responsibility of kind of assessing and giving them recommendations on, what should they consider doing to their apps once we know that a new version of iOS is coming. Can you talk a little bit about what's the process that we would generally recommend following, and sort of the timing of that? So if a beta becomes available in June, does that mean you need to be testing your app in June? And what kinds of things are you looking for? Let's just talk a little bit about what's the sort of process that we would typically go through.
So as a partner, of Apple, right, we get, we'll get the kind of, beta release right away, right? And then they usually publish some documentation to start with, right, of hey, these are sort of what we know, right, as, as changes, as breaking changes. And to Apple's credit, they do a really good job of minimizing the impact on developers and existing apps, right? It's really hard to have a device, right, that, people are upgrading every year, every 2 years, right, and remain, backwards compatible. And so they put a lot of work and thought into that. So they'll give us a sort of a checklist, right? And we'll kind of go through the checklist, and that'll help us identify sort of which clients' apps, right, we know for sure are affected, right? Then beyond the checklist, though, right, I mean, you can do everything in the checklist, right, and you can load the beta onto it, right, and see it crash, right? So so there's no substitute, I guess, for testing it, right, and trying to get ahead of it and keep ahead of it. And typically, we would recommend, to our clients, or those that are in maintenance, right, that each time that a beta drops, right, we'll compile the app, against the beta, and run through and sort of profile the behavior, right, and look for anything that that looks suspicious, or or obvious, right, that that's not working correctly. And honestly, you'll have to do it again, right, when the Gold Master comes out, right, and then that will be sort of determine what the final changes are that the app will have to go through. It's tough to say exactly how much or how little an app is impacted. I would say that in my experience has been that the even number of releases, they tend to have a lot more new features, sort of external facing stuff, and the odd ones typically have been more sort of focused on internal and tightening things up. So I would expect iOS 14 to have more impact on client apps than the previous version. Uh, Although the previous version when it came out, right, had a lot of issues with multi-threading, and that's gotten a lot better with the dot releases. But my understanding is that in iOS 14, there's been a lot of work done there as well. So in some respects, I guess maybe it will improve some of the performance issues that apps have been having.
Mm, okay. And I think we could probably do a whole session on just releases for mobile apps, because there's a lot to that that I think probably would benefit this audience a lot. So we may not go into that in much depth, and maybe we can do another one of these recordings just on the topic of mobile app release best practices, because I think there's a lot of things that we've learned over the years that could save people a lot of pain and trouble. But is there anything in particular, for instance, crash logging or something specifically that really does become even more valuable about release management when you're talking about releasing after a major iOS update?
Yeah, of course, the crash logging is pretty critical, right? Just because you need to isolate, you need to isolate the crash to a specific OS, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how the new OS is impacting what you're doing. It can be a little bit tricky, right? Because you can get some false signals, because typically when a new OS comes out, you're releasing a new version of your app, right? So now, are the crashes because of the new OS, or is it because of something that you've changed in the app, right? So at that point, right, you really need to be able to break it down and say, yeah, after this release, right, crashes went up, but those crashes, are only occurring on the old version of the OS or the new version of the OS. So it's pretty important just to be able to make that differentiation.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, good. It'll be interesting to see if timing of these releases changes any with all of the coronavirus. I mean, I would be surprised if the developer conference doesn't get interrupted if they haven't already announced any changes to that. I know it's June, but that's a big conference with a lot of people together all at the same time. I'd be interested in what Apple makes as a change to that this year.
Yeah, they've already announced that it won't be in person, right?
Really?
So they're going to do some virtual stuff.
Some sort of virtual thing. Got it. Yeah. Okay. So anything else that comes to mind? Anything else that you've read that you think might show up in iOS 14 that we haven't talked about already?
Mm. No, I mean, there are 1,000 different blogs and websites dedicated to rumors, right, about what will or won't be in the next version of the OS, but I mean, really, you don't know until you know, right? So.
Yeah, and I think that's probably an important distinction. That's not really the point of this conversation so much, because like you said, there's people who spend an awful lot of time trying to determine what's going to be out there, ahead of time. I think really what we want to be able to do is more prepare the audience for what can you do right now to be better prepared for those releases and make sure that there's no interruption to your app and that you can kind of plan for it ahead of time. So I think really getting your hands on that beta pretty early and running that, and then if they are running their app against that beta bill, are they going to get warnings about things like the OpenGL issue that you discussed earlier?
Yeah, they should get warnings for sure, right? As well as, I mean, if if the library is deprecated entirely, right? I mean, it won't even compile. So.
Got it. Okay. So there's an easy check there. I think the key is just to get to it early, right? Is the earlier you can get a check on it, the better you can respond to it and be smarter about the way you respond. And you certainly don't want to get into a situation where you got a live app that is still in the app store that gets affected, especially for a user facing like outage, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there's not really, I mean, there's not really a lot of mitigation options that you have, right? Like once you're in that position, right? It's
Yeah.
not like, you know, I mean, you can send an email, right? But it's unlikely that they're going to, reverse decision and roll out a whole new version of the OS, right?
Yeah, very unlikely. So I guess the big takeaway is check it out early and plan ahead, right?
Yeah, and if you're not sure, right? I mean, find somebody that specializes in that can go through and help you sort of make sure that you're ready.
Absolutely. And great. So I guess that's I think that's the main things that we wanted to cover on this call today. Anything else around upcoming releases or anything like that, Bill, that you wanted to mention before we kind of wrap up?
No, I'm just excited to see what new challenges, right, are thrown at us, and what new features are available, right? Because that's really the exciting part, right? Is
Right.
it's not so much what we're talking about is how to keep your app from breaking, but it's, hey, what are the new cool things that are available to us, right? That we can better engage our audiences and reach them. So.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So we'll have to wait and see, like everybody else, I suppose. So if you want more information, feel free to post a comment. We'll try to get back if you have specific questions that we could answer for you or help find an answer for. If you're interested more in what kinds of services we offer for our client, you can check us out at eno8.com. That's ENO, the number 8.com. And LinkedIn, Facebook, we're there too. So feel free to reach out. Thanks for listening in, and we'll see you guys with the next one, which we'll come up with a great topic for you guys for our next call. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.